A Sick Planet. A Sick Planet Guide Debord translated by Donald Nicholson Smith, LJHRTL, T. Point. A note of the 3 independent texts by Guy Debord included here. 2 were first published as pamphlets, while the third was written in 1971 for inclusion in a projected 13th issue of the Situationist International's journal, which never appeared because of the group's dissolution. Despite the seeming diversity of the subjects discussed, the What's riots and the decline and fall of the spectacular commodity economy. 1965. The disintegration of bureaucratic power and the explosion point of ideology in China. Pollution and its representation in A Sick Planet. 1971. All 3 texts deal with the varied forms of the spectacle and its repercussions, and despite the dates of their composition, all 3 remain startlingly relevant today. Alice Debord, The Decline and Fall of the Spectacular Commodity Economy. This article was first published by the Situationist International in English translation as a pamphlet, without the illustrations. A modified version of the translation was included in Ken Nab, ed. in Trans. Situationist International Anthology. The translator of the present volume has taken this opportunity to revise his English version of 1965. Guy Debord's original French text, La Décline et la chute et l'économie spectaculaire marquante, first appeared under the collective signature of the Situationists and Internationale Situationiste IO. The work was republished in 1993, signed by Debord alone, as a small volume. Paris, Jean-Jacques Pauvert aux Belles Lettres. The entire remaining stock of this edition was destroyed in a warehouse fire on May 29, 2002. The French text may also be found in Guy Debord, Ovre, from TIIETI 13T to TIIE 16T of August 1965. The blacks of Los Angeles rose up. An incident involving traffic police and pedestrians developed into 2 days of spontaneous rioting. The agents of law enforcement, though beefed up repeatedly, were unable to regain control of the streets. By the 3rd day, the blacks had armed themselves by looting such gun shops as were accessible, and were able to open fire on police helicopters. Thousands of soldiers and police, including the military weight of an entire infantry division, supported by tanks, had to be thrown into the conflict so as to confine the rebellion to the What's area, after which it took several days and much fighting in the streets before things could be brought under control. The rioters did not hesitate to plunder neighborhood shops and then set them on fire. Official figures report 32 dead, including 27 blacks, more than 800 wounded and some 3,000 locked up. Reactions across the board were characterized by the lucidity that revolutionary events being themselves clarifications and acts of existing problems are always uniquely able to confer on the varied utterances of their opponents. Thus Chief of Police William Parker refused all offers of mediation from the main black organizations, stating, quite correctly, that the rioters had no leaders. Indeed, inasmuch as the blacks no longer had leaders, this was the moment of truth for both parties. What did Roy Wilkins, General Secretary of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, want at that moment? He declared that the riots should be put down with all necessary force, and Cardinal McIntyre of Los Angeles, though he protested loudly, did not protest against the violence of the repression, the intelligent thing to do, one might have thought, during the Catholic Church's current period of ornamento. Instead, he protested in the most urgent tones about a premeditated revolt against the rights of one's neighbor, against respect for law and order, and called upon Catholics to oppose the looting and the violence which had no apparent justification. Even those prepared to acknowledge apparent justifications for the black anger in Los Angeles, though not, of course, any real ones, all the theorists and spokesmen of the international left, or, rather, of its nothingness, deplored the irresponsibility and disorder, the looting, especially the fact that liquor and weapons were the first targets for plunder, and, above all, the estimated 2,000 fires started by the What's petrol throwers to light up their battle and their celebration. But who has defended the rioters of Los Angeles in the terms they deserve? Well, we shall. Let us leave the economists to grieve over the $27 million lost and the town planners over one of their most beautiful supermarkets gone up in smoke, and McIntyre over his slain deputy sheriff. Let the sociologists weep over the absurdity and the euphoria of this rebellion. The task of a revolutionary journal is not only to endorse the Los Angeles insurgents, but also to help supply them with their reasons, to offer a theoretical account of the truth sought implicitly by their practical action. In the address to revolutionaries of Algeria and of all countries which they published in Algiers in July 1965, following Boumedienne's coup d'état, the Situationists described conditions in Algeria and in the rest of the world as a whole. Among their examples, they evoked the black movement in America which, if it could assert itself in a cogent way, would unmask the contradictions of capitalism in its most advanced form. 5 weeks later, just such a cogency erupted into the streets. Theoretical criticism of the most novel aspects of modern society and criticism in acts of that same society coexist at present, still separated but both confronting the same reality, both talking of the same thing. These two critiques are mutually explanatory, each being incomprehensible without the other. Our theory of survival and of the spectacle is illuminated and verified by these actions, as unintelligible as they may be to America's false consciousness. One day these actions will in turn be illuminated by this theory. Hitherto, civil rights demonstrations had been kept by the black leadership within the limits of a legal system which tolerated the most appalling violence on the part of the police and the racists, as for instance, in Alabama the previous March, during the Montgomery March, and, As if this outrage was not sufficient, a discreet agreement between the federal government, Governor Wallace and Pastor King had led the Selma marchers on March 10 to fall back at the first request, in dignity and prayer. The confrontation anticipated by the crowd of protesters was turned into a mere spectacle into a strictly notional event. Nonviolence thus reached the pitiful limit of its courage. First expose yourself to the enemy's blows, then demonstrate your moral superiority by sparing that enemy the trouble of any further resort to force. The basic fact is that the civil rights movement, by remaining within the law, raises only legal issues. It is logical to make an appeal to the law by legal means. What is not logical is to use legal pleadings to confront raw injustice as though it were a nonsense that would disappear as soon as it was pointed out. Clearly, the surface-level, outrageously blatant injustice that still affects blacks in many American states has its roots in a socio-economic contradiction that is beyond the remit of existing laws, and that no future legislation will be able to get rid of in face of the deeper, cultural laws of a society where black people are at last daring to demand the right to live. The truth is that American blacks want the total subversion of that society or nothing. The question of the necessity for such subversion arises of its own accord the moment blacks start using subversive means. The resort to such methods happens on the level of daily life, appearing at one and the same time as the most accidental and the most objectively justified development. This issue is broader than the condition of American blacks. It is the condition of America itself, even if blacks are the first to have raised it. For Watts was not a racial conflict. The rioters left whites who were in their path alone, attacking only the white policemen. Similarly, black solidarity did not extend to black shopkeepers, nor even to black drivers. Even Martin Luther King, in Paris in October, had to acknowledge that things had overshot the bounds of his specialization. These were not race riots, he said. They were class riots. The Los Angeles revolt was a revolt against the commodity, against a world of commodities. Critique of city planning. Supermarket, Los Angeles, August, 1965. America has wasted no time investigating this new scourge. For several months now, sociologists, politicians, psychologists, economists and experts of every stripe have been trying to trace its roots. This is not a neighborhood in the ordinary sense of the word. Rather, it is a soul-destroying, vast, monotonous plain, a single-story America, all on one level, the bleakest of American landscapes, with its flat-roofed houses, its stores all selling the same thing, its hamburger stands, its service stations, and everything blighted by poverty and strewn with rubbish. Motor traffic is less dense than elsewhere, but pedestrians are hardly more numerous for all that. Dwellings seem few and far between, and the distances demoralize. White passers-by attract stares which if not hateful are at least sardonic. Just more research people is a widely heard refrain. More sociologists. They come with lots of questions, but they don't bring us any jobs. As for housing conditions, they could certainly be improved physically, but it is hard to see how it would be possible to stop white people leaving en masse as soon as blacks start moving in. The blacks themselves are bound to continue feeling that they have been left to their own devices, especially in the vast expanses of a city like Los Angeles, with no real center, without so much as a crowd into which to blend, where whites glimpse their fellow citizens only through their car windscreens. Speaking in Watts a few days after the riots, Martin Luther King called on his race brothers and sisters to link arms, in response to which someone in the crowd shouted and burn it down. It is a reassuring sight to come upon so-called middle-class neighborhoods, not far from Watts, where members of the new black middle class mow their lawns in front of luxurious residences. Michel Tatou, Le Monde, November 3, 1965, and of worker consumers hierarchically subordinated to the measuring rod of the commodity. The blacks of Los Angeles like groups of young delinquents in all advanced countries, but in a more radical way, inasmuch as they belong to a class globally deprived of a future, a sector of the proletariat unable to see any significant prospect of advancement or integration. Take modern capitalist propaganda, with its touting of affluence, at its word. They want all the objects displayed and available in the abstract, right now, because they want to use them. In this they are rejecting their exchange value, that commodity reality which is their mold, motor and raison d'etre, and which has pre-selected them all. Through theft and gift, they retrieve a use which instantly gives the lie to the oppressive rationality of commodities, showing their relations and even their manufacture to be arbitrary and unnecessary. The plunder in what's certainly embodied, in the simplest possible form, the perverse principle of each according to his false needs, the needs defined and produced by the very economic system that the act of looting contested. Yet inasmuch as the idea of abundance was taken literally and embraced in the immediate instead of being pursued indefinitely in the rat race of alienated labor and increasing, ever deferred social needs, real desires also found expression in the shape of festivity, playful affirmation, and the potlatch of destruction. To destroy commodities is to demonstrate one's human superiority to commodities, to free oneself from the arbitrary forms that cloak the image of real needs, the flames of what's consumed consumption. The theft of large refrigerators by people with no electricity, or with their power cut off, is the best possible metaphor for the lie of affluence transformed into truth and once it is no longer bought, the commodity lies open to criticism and modification in all its playing with rifled cash register particular manifestations. Only so long as it is paid for with money, as a status symbol of survival, can it be worshipped fetishistically. Looting is the natural response to the affluent society. The affluence, however, is by no means natural or human. It is simply an abundance of commodities. Looting, moreover, which instantly destroys commodities as such, discloses their ultima ratio, namely the army, the police and the other specialized detachments which have the monopoly of armed force within the state. What is a policeman? He is the active servant of commodities, a man utterly subject to the commodity, whose job is to ensure that a given product of human labor remains a commodity with the magical property of having to be paid for instead of becoming a mere fridge or rifle, a mute, passive, insensible thing, captive to the first comer to make use of it. By rejecting the indignity of being answerable to the police, the blacks and Watts implicitly rejected the indignity of depending on commodities. The youth of Watts, having no future in market terms, grasped another quality of the present, and the truth of that present was so irresistible that it engaged the whole population, women, children, even sociologists who happened to find themselves on the scene. A young black sociologist of the district, Bobby Holland, had this to say to the New York Herald Tribune in October. Before, people were ashamed to say they came from Watts. They'd mumble it. Now, they say it with pride. Boys who always went around with their shirts open to the waist, and who'd have cut you into strips in half a second, used to apply here every morning. They organized the food distribution. Of course, it's no good pretending the food wasn't looted. All that Christian law has been used too long against blacks. These people could rob for 10 years, and they wouldn't get back half the money that has been stolen from them all these years. Myself, I'm just a little black girl, spattered by blood during the rioting. Bobby Holland has sworn never to clean the stains from her shoes. Now, she added, all the world looks to Watts' quoted material retranslated from French. Trans, how do men make history? Starting from conditions designed to persuade them not to take a hand in it. Los Angeles blacks are better paid than any others in the United States, but it is also here that they are furthest behind that high point of affluence, which is California. Hollywood, capital of the worldwide spectacle, is in their immediate vicinity. They are promised that, with patience, they will join in America's prosperity, but they realize that this prosperity is not a static sphere but, rather, a ladder without end. The higher they climb, the further they get from the top, because they don't have a fair start, because they are less skilled and thus more numerous among the unemployed and, finally, because the hierarchy which crushes them is not one based simply on buying power as a pure economic fact. An essential inferiority is imposed on them in every area of daily life by the customs and prejudices of a society in which all human power is based on buying power. So long as the human riches of American blacks are despised and treated as criminal, monetary riches will never make them acceptable to the alienated society of America. Individual wealth may make one black man rich, but blacks as a whole must represent poverty in a society of hierarchically distributed wealth. Every witness noted this cry which proclaims the fundamental meaning of the rising. This is the Black Revolution, and we want the world to know it. Freedom now is the password of all historical revolutions, but here, for the first time, it is not poverty but material abundance that must be controlled according to new laws. The control of abundance is not just changing the way it is shared out, but redefining its every orientation, superficial and profound alike. This is the first skirmish of an enormous struggle, infinite in its implications. Blacks are not isolated in their struggle, because a new proletarian consciousness, the consciousness of not being the master of one's activity, of one's life, in the slightest degree, is taking form in America among other strata who likewise refuse modern capitalism and, in that sense, resemble blacks. Indeed, the first phase of the black struggle has given the signal to a movement of opposition which is spreading. In December 1964, the students of Berkeley, hobbled by the institution in their attempts to participate in the civil rights movement, eventually went on strike against California's multiversity itself and, by extension, against the social system of the United States in which they are allotted such a passive role. Immediately, orgies of drinking and drug-taking and dissolute sex were said to be rife among the students, just the kind of behavior for which blacks have ever been castigated. This generation of students has since invented a new form of struggle against the dominant spectacle, the teach-in-a form adopted at Edinburgh University on October 20th apropos of the crisis in Rhodesia. This clearly imperfect and primitive stage in the development of opposition involves discussing problems without any of the time limits prescribed by academic convention. By their nature, such meetings seek to carry issues to their logical conclusion, which is practical action. Also in October, thousands of demonstrators appeared in the streets of Berkeley and New York, their cries echoing those of the Watts rioters. Get out of our neighborhood and out of Vietnam. White people, increasingly radicalized, have begun to flout the law. Courses are given on how to hoodwink army recruiters, draft cards are burnt and the act televised. In the affluent society, disgust for affluence and for its price is finding an outlet. The spectacle is being marred by an advanced social sector whose autonomous action negates spectacular values. The traditional proletariat in the United States, precisely because it has been provisionally integrated into the capitalist system, has failed to integrate black workers. Several Los Angeles unions refused to accept blacks until 1959. Now, blacks are the rallying point for all who refuse the logic of integration into that system, integration into capitalism being, of course, the ne plus ultra of the integration on offer. Comfort can never be comfortable enough for those who seek what is not on the market or, rather, what the market shuts out. The level reached by the technology of the most privileged becomes an insult, and one more easily denounced than the most basic insult, which is reification. The Los Angeles Rebellion is the first in history to justify itself on the grounds that there was no air conditioning during a heat wave. Integration into what? American blacks have their own spectacle, complete with its press, magazines and colored film stars, and, if blacks realize this, if they spew out this spectacle as phony, as an expression of their humiliation, it is because they see it to be a minority phenomenon, nothing but an appendage of the spectacle in general. Since they perceive that this parade of their consumption to be desired is merely a colony of the wider system, they see through the lie of the overall economic-cultural spectacle more quickly. By wanting to participate really and immediately in a film scene, this is an official value of every American. They demand the egalitarian realization of the American spectacle of everyday life. They demand that the half-heavenly, half-earthly values of this spectacle be put to the test. But it is of the essence of the spectacle that it cannot be made real either immediately or equally, and this not even for whites. In fact, the function of blacks in the spectacle is to serve as the perfect prod in the race for wealth. Such underprivilege is an incitement to ambition. In taking the capitalist spectacle at its face value, blacks are already rejecting the spectacle itself. The spectacle is a drug for slaves. It is not supposed to be taken literally, but followed at just a few paces. If it were not for this tiny distance, it would become total mystification. The fact is that in the United States today, whites are enslaved to commodities, while blacks negate them. Blacks ask for more than whites. That is the core of an insoluble problem, or rather a problem soluble only through the dissolution of the white social system. This is why those whites who want to escape their own servitude must needs rally to the black cause, not in a solidarity based on color, obviously, but in a global rejection of commodities and, in the last analysis, of the state. The economic and psychological gulf between blacks and whites is precisely what allows blacks to see what the white consumer is, and their justified contempt for whites in this respect becomes contempt for any passive consumer. Whites who cast off their role have no chance unless they link their struggle more and more to the black struggle, discovering its real and consistent reasons for themselves and supporting it to the hilt. If such an alliance were to be broken in response to radicalization of the conflict, the upshot would be the development of a black nationalism and a confrontation between the two splinters exactly on the model of the prevailing system. Tit-for-tat slaughter is the other possible outcome of the present situation. Once resignation becomes unbearable, attempts to build a separatist or pro-African black nationalism are dreams offering no answer to the reality of oppression. American blacks have no native country. They are at once in their own country and alienated. So is the rest of the population, but blacks differ insofar as they are aware of it. In this sense, they are not the most backward sector of their society but the most advanced. They are negation at work, the bad side that produces the movement which makes history by setting up a struggle. Africa has nothing to do with it. American blacks are as much a product of modern industry as electronics, advertising or the cyclotron. They carry its contradictions within them. They are people that the spectacular paradise must integrate and repulse simultaneously, with the result that in their particular case the antagonism between the spectacle and the real activity of human beings is patent. The spectacle is universal, as is the commodity. But since the world of commodities is founded on an opposition between classes, commodities are themselves hierarchical. The necessity for commodities and, hence, for the spectacle that structures the commodity world to be at once universal and hierarchical leads to a universal imposition of hierarchy. But inasmuch as this reality must not be acknowledged, it expresses itself as hierarchical attributions of value that are unacknowledgeable, irrational, in a world rationalized without recourse to reason. It is this hierarchizing process which creates racisms everywhere. The English Labour government has just restricted colored immigration, while the industrially advanced countries of Europe are once again becoming racist as they import their subproletariat from the Mediterranean area in order to exploit the colonized within the borders of the colonial power. Similarly, Russia remains anti-Semitic because it is still a hierarchical society where labor must be sold as a commodity. In tandem with commodities, hierarchy is forever reconstituting itself in new forms, forever proliferating. This may be observed as readily in the relations between a trade unionist and a worker as between the respective owners of two cars with bogus distinguishing features. This is the fatal flaw of commodity rationality, the sickness of bourgeois reason hereditary in the case of the bureaucracy, but the repulsive gratuitousness of some hierarchies, and the fact that the entire might of the commodity world is blindly and automatically mobilized in their defense, means that no sooner is some negating practice initiated than the absurdity of all hierarchy becomes apparent. The rational world born of the Industrial Revolution has rationally liberated individuals from their local and national limitations and linked them on a world scale, but its unreason separates them once more, according to a hidden logic reflected in crazy ideas and grotesque values. Having become estranged from its world, humanity is completely surrounded by what is alien to it. The barbarians are no longer at the ends of the earth. They are right here barbarized, in fact, by this very same forced participation in hierarchical consumption. The humanism cloaking all this is opposed to humanity, the negation of human activity and desires. It is the humanism of commodities, the benevolence of the parasitic commodity towards its host. For those who reduce human beings to objects, objects seem to acquire human qualities, and manifestations of real human activity appear as animal unconsciousness. For William Parker, chief humanist of Los Angeles, the What's Rock throwers were behaving like monkeys in a zoo. When the California authorities announced that a state of insurrection existed, the insurance companies recalled that they did not cover risks at that level. Indeed, nothing is insured beyond bare survival. By and large, American blacks may be certain that if they keep quiet, at least their survival is underwritten. Capitalism has become sufficiently centralized and entrenched in the state to distribute welfare to the poorest, precisely because they lag behind as socially organized survival. All this world is like a valley called Jeremiah, Song of the Lincoln Brigade. The people's militias have collapsed in the face of the tanks and machine guns in the northern districts of Santo Domingo. After 4 days and 4 nights of violent and bloody combat, General Mert's troops at last succeeded in advancing to within a short distance of Guardia Avenue and the Villa Consuelo Market. At 6 in the morning of Wednesday, the Radio Santo Domingo headquarters was besieged. This building, where the television studios are also located, is 200 meters north of Francia Avenue and the corridor controlled by the Marines. It had been bombarded the Thursday before by General Wesson Y. Wesson's Dominican Air Force fighters. Sporadic fighting continued throughout Wednesday in the northwestern part of the city, but the popular resistance has now suffered its first defeat. The civilians fought almost alone, for few of the members of the military who had joined Colonel Camino were to be found north of the corridor. The militias in the sector are largely led by workers belonging to the Dominican Popular Movement, a left-wing organization. Their sacrifice has won 5 days, which may turn out to be of great value to the April 24th uprising. In the lower city, heaped-up oil drums served as a rather feeble excuse for barricades, and overturned delivery vans were used for cover. Weapons were ill-assorted, costumes likewise. There were civilians in round low helmets and soldiers in forage caps. Revolvers bulged in the blue jean pockets of office workers and students. All the women intending to fight wore pants. 16-year-old boys clutched their rifles desperately to their chests like gifts they had been waiting for since the beginning of the world. Radio Santo Domingo made incessant appeals to the people, urging a massive movement to this location or that in the city where it is feared Wesson is about to attack. It was at the entrance to the Duarte Bridge, at the crossroads with Lieutenant Amado Garfa Avenue, that the crowd massed, Molotov cocktails at the ready. When Wesson's fighters appeared, flying at the lowest possible altitude along the bridge, thousands of fists rose furiously in their direction. The rat-tat-tat of their guns left dozens of crumpled bodies in its wake. The crowd fled back towards the houses, only to return after every strafing. Each attack elicited the same explosion of impotent rage and a fresh muster of corpses. Yet it seemed as though the entire population would have to be killed before the Duarte Bridge could be cleared of humanity. On Monday, the April 26th, Ambassador Tapley Bennett, Jr., returned from Florida. That evening the assault ship USS Boxer reached Santo Domingo with 1,500 Marines on board. Marcel Niedergang, Le Monde, May 21 and June 5, 1965, expands. However, blacks present problems of life. What they demand is not to survive but to live. They have nothing of their own to insure. They might as well destroy all forms of private security and insurance known hitherto. They appear as what they really are, the irreconcilable enemies not of the vast majority of Americans, but of the alienated way of life of modern society at large. The most advanced industrialized country merely shows us the path that will be followed everywhere unless the system is overthrown. Some extreme black nationalists, to show why they could never accept anything less than a separate state, have argued that American society, even if it someday concedes general civic and economic equality, will never see its way clear to accepting interracial marriages. It is therefore this American society which must disappear, not only in America but everywhere in the world. The end of all racial prejudice, like the end of so many other prejudices related to inhibitions that restrain sexual freedom, can only lie beyond marriage itself, that is, beyond the bourgeois family very tenuous among American blacks, an arrangement that prevails in Russia just as in the United States as a model of hierarchical relationships and of the stability of inherited power, whether of wealth or of social bureaucratic status. It is now often said that American youth, after 30 years of silence, is rising again as a force of opposition, and that the Black Revolt is its Spanish Civil War. If so, its Lincoln Brigades need to understand the full significance of the struggle in which they are engaged, supporting it to the end in its universality. The excesses of the blacks of Los Angeles are no more a political error than the armed resistance of the PALM in the Barcelona of May, 1937, was a betrayal of the war against Franco. Any rebellion against the spectacle occurs at the level of the totality, because even if it is confined to a single neighborhood, such as what's it is a human protest against an inhuman life, because it begins at the level of the real single individual, and because community, from which the individual in revolt is separated, is the true social nature of man, true human nature, the positive transcendence of the spectacle. The Explosion Point of Ideology in China, La Point d'Explosion de l'Idéologie en Chine, was published as a pamphlet by the Situationist International in August 1967, and reprinted in Interneti Situationiste LL. The text may also be found in Guy Debord. Over. The translator acknowledges his debt to an earlier English version published in Ken Nab, ed. in Trans. Situationist International Anthology, Berkeley, CA. Bureau of Public Secrets, 1981. The breakup of the International Association of Totalitarian Bureaucracies is now a fait accompli. To recall the terms used in the address to the revolutionaries of Algeria and of all countries published by the Situationists in Algiers in July 1965, the irreversible crumbling of the revolutionary image that the bureaucratic lie holds up as the enemy of capitalist society as a whole, as that society's pseudo-negation and real support, is now plain to see. and this primarily on the very domain where official capitalism has the greatest interest in sustaining the fiction of an adversary, the global confrontation between the bourgeoisie and the so-called socialist bloc. Despite all sorts of attempts to patch things up, it is now evident that what was already not socialist is now no longer even a bloc. The decay of the Stalinist monolith is now clearly signaled by the coexistence of 20 or so independent lines ranging from Romania to Cuba and from Italy to the common program of the Vietnamese, Korean and Japanese parties. Russia, which proved incapable this year of convening a conference of all European communist parties, would prefer to forget the time when Moscow reigned over the Comintern. Thus Izvestia, in September 1966, could blame the Chinese leaders for discrediting Marxist-Leninist ideas in an unprecedented way, and piously deplore a confrontational style which substitutes insults for the exchange of opinions and revolutionary experiences. Those who take this path confer absolute value on their own experience and display a dogmatic and sectarian approach to the interpretation of Marxist-Leninist theory. Such an attitude inevitably goes hand in hand with interference in the internal affairs of fraternal parties. The Russian-Chinese debate, in which each of the two powers is led to impute every kind of anti-proletarian crime to its adversary, save that no mention may ever be made of one real crime, namely the class power of the bureaucracy, is thus bound to end for both parties with a disabused realization that what was never anything but an inexplicable revolutionary mirage must be identical, in the absence of any other reality, to the status quo ante. The nakedness of this return to square one was perfectly exposed in February in New Delhi, when the Chinese embassy described Brezhnev and Kosygin as new czars of the Kremlin, while the Indian government, which was allied with this new Muscovy, concluded at the same moment that the present masters of China have donned the imperial mantle of the Manchus. This censure of the new dynasty of the Middle Kingdom was further refined the following month in Moscow, when the modernist state poet Andrei Voznesensky got a scent of Kuchum and his hordes and felt that only eternal Russia could be counted on to raise a bulwark against the Mongols threatening to pitch their tents amid the Egyptian treasures of the Louvre. The accelerating disintegration of bureaucratic ideology, which is just as apparent in the countries where Stalinism has seized power as in those others where any chance of its coming to power has evaporated, was bound to begin with the question of internationalism, but this was just the beginning of a general, irreversible collapse. Internationalism could never be embraced by the bureaucracy save as a deceptive slogan serving its real interests, as one ideological self-justification among others, for bureaucratic society is, precisely, proletarian community turned on its head. The bureaucracy is in essence a form of power founded on the possession of the national state, and it must ultimately bow to the logic of that reality in accordance with the particular interests imposed by the stage of development of the country that it controls. Its heroic period passed with the halcyon days of the ideology of socialism in one country, which Stalin took such good care to uphold as he proceeded to destroy revolutions in China or Spain. The later independent bureaucratic revolution in China, like that in Yugoslavia a little earlier, administered a dissolving agent to the bureaucratic world that would break the monolith apart in less than 20 years. The broad degeneration of bureaucratic ideology is now approaching its limit in the very country where, on account of overall economic backwardness, the remnants of ideological pretension to revolution must be boosted to the maximum. The very country, in short, where ideology is most needed, namely China. The crisis that has been steadily widening in China since the spring of 1966 is without precedent in bureaucratic societies. Certainly, the ruling class of bureaucratic state capitalist systems in Russia or Eastern Europe, which in the normal way uses terror to cow the exploited majority, has often found itself torn apart internally by clashes and vendettas sparked by the objective difficulties that it encounters, or else by the subjectively delusional style that a totally mendacious power is forced to adopt. But hitherto the bureaucracy whose mode of appropriation of the economy requires centralization, since the hierarchical authority for any participation in its collective extraction of social surplus value flows from itself alone, has always purged its ranks from the top. The pinnacle of the bureaucracy must remain stable, because the entire legitimacy of the system resides therein. Strife at the top must be kept at the top, a principle faithfully applied from the time of Lenin and Trotsky. Although eminent individuals can be killed or replaced, high functions themselves must retain their impregnable majesty. Arbitrary and unanswerable repression may then work its way down in the usual way through level after level of the apparatus, as the simple and automatic corollary of what has been decided at the summit. For instance, Beria must first be killed, then judged, after which his tendency can be hounded. Indeed, anyone at all may be hunted down, for authority invested with the power of life and death defines tendency in whatever way it pleases, and in so doing reaffirms itself as authority. All this is precisely what has not happened in China, where the continued survival of the declared antagonists, despite the fantastic upward spiraling of stakes and the struggle for absolute power, clearly indicates that the ruling class has split in two. A social occurrence of such magnitude can obviously not be explained, in the anecdotal fashion of bourgeois commentators. In terms of differences over foreign policy, it is glaringly obvious, for instance, that the Chinese bureaucracy is quite happy to ignore the insult represented by the crushing of Vietnam at its very doorstep, nor could mere personal rivalries concerning the handing over of the reins of power have thrown so much in the balance. When certain leaders are denounced for having kept Mao Zedong away from power since the end of the 1950s, everything suggests one of those charges so often invented after the fact in bureaucratic purges, like the claim that Trotsky contrived the civil war on orders from the Mikado, or that Zinoviev backed Lenin to please the British Empire, and so on. Anyone who had really evicted a person as powerful as Mao from his leadership position would never never have slept a wink so long as Mao might make a comeback. Mao would perforce have been done away with on the first day, thus allowing his successors, with the greatest of ease, to attribute his demise to, say, Khrushchev. The leaders and pamphleteers of the other bureaucratic states undoubtedly understand the Chinese crisis far better than their capitalist counterparts in the West. But their utterances are no more reliable for that because they must be afraid that in speaking of China, they run the risk of revealing too much about themselves. In the end, it is the remnants of leftism in Western countries ever ready to be duped by propaganda with the slightest whiff of subliminalism who are likely to err more egregiously than anyone. They are much given to solemnly assessing the part played in Chinese society by the vestiges of rent allowed to capitalists loyal to the regime, or to searching for some leader or another in the general melee who might represent a leftist tendency or promote workers' autonomy. The most obtuse accept the notion that there really was something cultural about the great proletarian cultural revolution, or at least they did so until January, when the Maoist press played a dirty trick on them by admitting that from the outset it was a power struggle. In point of fact, the only question worth debating seriously is why and how the ruling class could have broken into two opposing camps. All inquiry along these lines is, of course, impossible. Portrait of alienation. This Chinese crowd, woven into portrait of Mao, may be considered a limiting case of spectacular state power in its concentrated form, the form which, in underdeveloped areas, distills everything admirable that one is supposed to applaud and passively consume into the ideological realm and, in extreme instances, into a single man. Here the fusion of the spectator and the contemplated image would seem to have achieved perfection in policing. Because the Chinese bureaucracy some time later chose to go beyond even this degree of spectacular concentration, it ended up by exploding the machine for those who do not accept that the bureaucracy is a ruling class, or who, alternatively, ignore that class specificity and explain it in terms of the classical bourgeois system. With respect to the why of the split within the bureaucracy, all that may be said with certainty is that the division was occasioned by an issue that jeopardized the very dominance of the ruling class, for, to resolve it, neither side in its unshakable obstinacy shrank from immediately putting the entire basis of their shared class power at risk and imperiling all the established prerequisites of their management of society. The ruling class must, therefore, have known that it could not go on governing as before. We can be sure that the present conflict concerns the management of the economy, and that the collapse of the bureaucracy's successive economic policies is what has made this conflict so critical. The failure of the so-called Great Leap Forward, chiefly due to resistance from the peasantry, not only put paid to the prospect of an ultra-voluntaristic surge in industrial production but also, disastrously, created a chaos that lasted for several years. Agricultural production itself seems to have increased very little since 1958, and population growth continues to outpace the staple food supply. It is less easy to tell exactly which economic issues have divided the ruling class. In all likelihood, one side, made up of much of the party apparatus, union leaders and economists, wanted to maintain or increase to a greater or lesser degree the production of consumer goods, and to use economic incentives to encourage labor to greater efforts, besides making a number of concessions to peasants and especially to industrial workers. This policy implied an increase in hierarchically differentiated consumption levels across a broad swath of the bureaucracy. The other camp, comprising Mao and a majority of higher-ranking military leaders, doubtless favored the resumption at all costs of efforts to industrialize the country and an ever more extreme reliance on ideological pressure and terror, unconstrained exploitation of the workers, and possibly a call for egalitarian consumer belt-tightening for a significant segment of lower-echelon functionaries. Both positions are designed to maintain the absolute sway of the bureaucracy, and both recognize the necessity for barricades to be erected against class struggles that threaten to upset that dominance. In any case, the urgent and essential nature of this choice was so obvious to all that both sides felt it necessary, by reason of the disorder created by this division, to risk immediately compromising the very conditions of their existence. It may very well be that the fierce determination of both sides is justified in the sense that the problems of the Chinese bureaucracy are, in fact, insurmountable, and that while the two contending strategies were thus equally inapplicable, it was still necessary to choose between them, in order to understand just how a split at the top of the bureaucracy could travel downwards, rallying cry by rallying cry, creating remote-controlled confrontations at every level of the party and state apparatus, and eventually among the masses. It should be borne in mind that remnants still exist of the old Chinese administrative system, based on quasi-autonomous provinces. The denunciation this January by the Beijing Maoists of independent fiefdoms clearly refers to this reality, and the growing disturbances over the last few months confirms it. It is likely that the phenomenon of regional bureaucratic autonomy, which manifested itself only weakly and sporadically during the counter-revolution in Russia, notably in connection with the party organization in Leningrad, was able to establish many solid bases in bureaucratic China, thus facilitating the coexistence within the central government of clans and interest groups that were, in effect, the direct bureaucratic owners of entire regions and struck bargains with one another on that basis. The bureaucratic power structure in China did not emerge from a workers' movement but, rather, from the militarization of the peasantry during a 22-year-long war. The army is still intertwined with the party, all of whose leaders are former high-ranking officers, and the military is still the party's favorite educational path upward for functionaries with peasant backgrounds. It seems, moreover, that the local administrations set up in 1949 relied very heavily on the zones through which the various army corps passed on their way south. leaving behind people in charge to whom they were closely bound by ties of shared regional origin, or indeed by family ties, a factor in the consolidation of bureaucratic cliques, starkly revealed by the propaganda directed at Liu Shaoqi and others. Local bastions of semi-independent power within the bureaucratic system may thus have grown up in China, thanks, on the one hand, to the organizational structure of the conquering army and, on the other, to the productive forces which that army was able to control in the subjugated regions. When the Mao faction began its public attack on its well-entrenched adversaries by dragooning and manipulating students and school children, there was no immediate intention to embark on any kind of cultural or civilizing makeover of the mass of workers. The workers were already tightly confined by the straitjacket of the regime's ideology. Inane condemnations of Beethoven or Ming art, like all the invective against positions still held or reoccupied by a Chinese bourgeoisie that has obviously been destroyed as such, were mere diversions, though it was no doubt felt that this kind of cruel leftism might always get a positive response from the oppressed masses, who do, after all, have some reason to feel that they are still faced by a few obstacles to the swift advent of a classless society. The chief purpose of the operation, however, was to have the regime's ideology, Maoist by definition, emerge onto the street in support of the Mao tendency. The Maoists' adversaries, since they themselves could not claim to be anything other than Maoists, were discomfited by the initiation of this entirely vacuous dispute. Their inadequate self-criticisms tended to reflect only their determination to hang on to their positions. The first phase in this tussle may thus be described as a clash between the official masters of ideology, on the one hand, and the majority of the masters of the state and the economic apparatus on the other. In order to maintain its collective grip on society, however, the bureaucracy as a whole needs to control both ideology and the administrative and repressive apparatus, so that allowing a rift of this kind to develop was a risky venture, especially if it could not be quickly closed. We know that most of the apparatus and Liu Shaoqi himself, despite the shakiness of his position in Beijing, put up an obstinate resistance. First, an attempt was made to prevent the tide of Maoist agitation from spreading beyond the universities, where work groups were set up as a counterforce, but this effort failed. The Maoists emerged onto the streets of all the larger cities and began to use wall posters and direct action to attack targeted officials everywhere and, not infrequently, committing errors and acting with an excessive zeal. The officials in question organized resistance wherever they could. In the first clashes between workers and the Red Guard, however, the workers were most likely led by party activists in the factories who were answerable to leaders prominent in the local power structure. Before long, though, the workers, exasperated by the Red Guard's excesses, began to take things into their own hands. Whenever the Maoists spoke of spreading the Cultural Revolution, first to the factories and later to the countryside, they gave the false impression that they were planning developments which, in reality, throughout the autumn of 1966, were completely beyond their control and which had, indeed, already occurred despite their best efforts. The drop in industrial production, the chaos in transportation, irrigation and throughout the state administration up to the ministerial level, the efforts of Zhou Enlai notwithstanding, the autumn and spring harvests jeopardized a complete halt to education, particularly serious in an underdeveloped country. For more than a year all these were the inevitable outcome of a struggle whose extension was solely due to the resistance put up by precisely that portion of the established bureaucracy which the Maoists were determined to vanquish. The Maoists, whose political experience has had very little to do with urban struggles, have thus had a good opportunity to measure the pertinence of Machiavelli's words of warning in his History of Florence. Let no one, when raising popular commotions, imagine he can afterward control them at his pleasure. After some months of pseudo-cultural pseudo-revolution, authentic class struggle raised its head as the workers and peasants began to act for themselves. The workers could not fail to realize what the Maoist perspective implied for them. As for the peasants, who saw their patches of land threatened, they proceeded in several provinces to share out the fields and equipment of the people's communes. The new ideological garb of the old administrative areas, often having the same boundaries as former cantons. Rail strikes were followed by a general strike in Shanghai denounced, as in Budapest, as the favorite weapon of the capitalists, by strikes in the great industrial conglomeration of Wuhan, in Guangzhou, in Hubei, and among metal workers and textile workers of Chongqing, and by attacks mounted by peasants in Sichuan and Fujian. These events came to a head in January, leaving China on the brink of chaos. During the same period, in the wake of the organizing of workers into Purple Guards in Guangxi as early as September 1966 to combat the Red Guard, and anti-Maoist rioting in Nanjing, armies were constituted in various provinces, such as the Army of August 1st in Guangdong. The National Army had to be sent to places throughout the country in February and March to subdue the workers, manage production through military control of the factories and, with the help of militias, even oversee labor in the countryside. The workers fight to maintain or increase their wages. The famous economistic tendency condemned by the Beijing leadership was sometimes accepted, even encouraged by local officials resisting rival Maoist apparatchiks. But there is no doubt that the struggle was led by an unstoppable tendency within the working class base. This is very clearly demonstrated by the summary dissolution in March of the professional associations formed after the earlier abolition of the state unions, whose bureaucracy could not be subordinated to the Maoist line. In Shanghai that March, for instance, the Jifeng Rebound announced a feudal tendency of these associations, which are formed not on a class basis for class basis, read, the foundations of an absolute monopoly of Maoist power, but instead on the basis of individual trades, the aim of their activity being the furtherance of the partial and short-term interests of the workers of a particular trade. This defense of the real owners of the general and permanent interests of the Commonwealth had been perfectly summed up on February 11 in a directive from the Council of State and the Military Commission of the Central Committee. All elements who have purloined or stolen arms must be arrested, at a moment when the task of resolving this conflict, which has evidently led to tens of thousands of deaths and pitted large military units with all their equipment, even warships, against one another, has fallen to the Chinese army. That army itself is divided. It is charged with ensuring the continuation and intensification of production, even though it is no longer capable of guaranteeing the unity of national power. Any direct intervention against a peasantry would moreover be fraught with danger, since the military is recruited for the most part from the countryside. That the Maoists should have sought a truce in March and April, declaring that all party workers were redeemable except for a handful of traitors, and that the main threat henceforward was anarchism, certainly reflected their concern about the difficulty of harnessing the energies unleashed among the youth by the Red Guard experience. But it also reflected their fundamental anxiety at having come to the very brink of the dissolution of the ruling class itself. The party, along with the provincial and central administration of the country, was now at disintegration point. It was essential to restore labor discipline. The principle of excluding and dismissing all party workers, said the Red Flag in March, must be totally rejected, and here is New China as early as February. It is all very well to crush all the organizers, but once you have taken over the organization, what do you have but an empty meeting room and some rubber stamps? Thereafter, rehabilitations and compromises followed in quick and random succession. The actual survival of the bureaucracy was the supreme cause that inevitably relegated its various political options to the level of mere means to that end. It is fair to say that, as of the spring of 1967, the movement known as the Cultural Revolution had turned into a disastrous failure, unquestionably the greatest failure in the long series of failures of bureaucratic power in China. Despite the extraordinary expense of the campaign, not one of its goals had been achieved. The bureaucracy was more divided than ever. Every new authority set up in the regions held by the Maoists would split in its tongue. The triple revolutionary alliance of the army, the Red Guard and the party was gradually falling apart by reason both of the antagonisms between its three components, with the party in particular standing aloof or entering merely in order to sabotage, and of the ever more acute antagonisms within each of these forces. Repairing the apparatus seemed as difficult as constructing another. Most important, at least two-thirds of China was in no way under the control of the central government in Beijing. In addition to the governmental committees of the followers of Liu Shaoqi and the movements of worker resistance, which continue to grow stronger, warlords have already re-emerged, in the uniform of independent communist generals. They deal directly with the central government and pursue their own policies, especially in frontier regions. General Zhuang Guohua, master of Tibet, used armored vehicles against the Maoists after street fighting broke out in Lhasa. 3 Maoist divisions were sent to crush the revisionists. They seem to have met with limited success for, in April, General Zhuang was still in control of the region. On May 1st, he was invited to Beijing, where negotiations produced a compromise under which he was made responsible for setting up a revolutionary committee to govern Sichuan, where, by April, a revolutionary alliance influenced by a certain General Hung had seized power and thrown the Maoists in jail. Then, in June, members of the People's Commune had taken up arms and attacked the army. In Inner Mongolia, on the orders of Liu Jiang, a deputy political commissar, the army declared its opposition to Mao as early as February. The same sort of thing happened in Hebei, Henan and Manchuria. In Gansu, in May, General Zhao Weiyongsh mounted a successful anti-Maoist putsch. Xinjiang, with its nuclear installations, was declared neutral by mutual agreement as early as March and placed under the authority of General Wang Enmao. Wang is nevertheless reported to have attacked Maoist revolutionaries in June. In July, Hubei was in the hands of Chen Zhetou, commander of the district of Wuhan, one of the oldest industrial centers in China. In the hallowed tradition of the Xi'an incident of 1935, Chen had 2 prominent leaders from Beijing sent to negotiate with him, placed under arrest. The prime minister was then obliged to travel to Hubei, and, when he succeeded in having his 2 emissaries freed, this was hailed as a victory. Meanwhile, 2,400 factories and mines in Hubei province were paralyzed following an armed uprising of 50,000 workers and peasants. By the beginning of summer, in fact, it was apparent that conflict was everywhere. In June, conservative workers in Henan firebombed a textile mill. In July, workers in the coal mines of Fushun and the oil refineries of Daxing went on strike. Jiangxi miners declared open season on Maoists. A call was made for struggle against the industrial army of Zhejiang, described as an anti-Marxist terrorist organization. Peasants threatened to march on Nanjing and Shanghai. There was fighting in the streets of Guangzhou and Chongqing, and students in Guiyang attacked the army and took Maoist leaders prisoner. The government, having resolved to quell violence in the regions controlled by the central authorities, obviously had its work cut out even there. Unable to stem the disturbances, it stemmed news of them by expelling most of the few foreign residents in the country. By the beginning of August, However, the rift in the army had become so dangerous that the official Beijing papers themselves acknowledged that the followers of Liu Shaoqi want to set up an independent reactionary bourgeois fiefdom within the army, and that attacks on the dictatorship of the proletariat in China have come not only from the upper levels but also from the lower ones. Beijing has ended up frankly admitting that at least a third of the army has declared its opposition to the central government and that the government has lost control of a large portion of traditional China with its 18 provinces. The immediate consequences of the Wuhan incident seem to have been very serious. Paratroopers from Beijing supported by 6 gunboats sent up the Yangs from Shanghai were repelled after a pitched battle. Elsewhere, arms have reportedly been supplied by the arsenals of Wuhan to anti-Maoists in Chongqing. It is notable too that the Wuhan forces concerned belonged to the army group under the direct command of Lin Bao, the only such group considered reliable. Now, in mid-August, armed conflicts have become so widespread that the Maoist government has ended up officially discarding the continuation of policy by means that backfire against it. It now claims to prefer persuasion, and vows to succeed in this by embracing the power of the pen. Simultaneously, however, it has announced the distribution of arms to the masses in loyal zones. But where are such zones to be found? Fighting has resumed in Shanghai, a city portrayed for months as a rare stronghold of Maoism. Soldiers in Shandong are inciting peasants to revolt. The leadership of the Air Force has been denounced as an enemy of the regime, and as the 47th Army moved to restore order in Guangzhou, that city, just as in the time of Sun Yat-sen, broke away and became a beacon of revolt, with the railway and urban transit workers acting as the spearhead. Political prisoners have been liberated, arms intended for Vietnam seized from freighters at the docks, and an unknown number of individuals hanged in the street. China is thus slowly sinking into a confused civil war, at once a struggle involving various regions within a crumbling bureaucratic state power structure, and a struggle by workers and peasants against the exploitation that it behoves the bureaucratic power centers, as rent-apart as they may be, to maintain everywhere. Since the Maoists have proved themselves masters of absolute ideology and notwithstanding the results thereof, noted above, an exorbitant amount of admiration and approbation has been heaped upon them by Western intellectuals, who never fail to salivate in response to stimuli of this sort. K.S. Carroll, for example, writing in La Nouvelle Observateur for February 15, 196-7, wagged a professorial finger at the Maoists for forgetting that real Stalinists are not potential allies of China but are most unrelenting enemies. The Cultural Revolution with its anti-bureaucratic tendencies reminds them of nothing so much as Trotskyism, nor has there been any shortage of actual Trotskyists happy to concur thereby. One might say, getting their own measure exactly. Le Monde, the most unashamedly Maoist newspaper outside China, has announced on a daily basis that Mao is on the point of successfully seizing a power that one might have supposed had belonged to him for the last 18 years. Academic China specialists, almost all of whom are Stalino-Catholics, a hybrid creature found everywhere, but especially in this milieu, have dredged up the notion of a Chinese soul to help legitimize the new Confucius. The ever-risible attitudes of mildly Stalinophile bourgeois intellectuals were brought to full flower by the Maoists' tallest tales, by their claim, for instance, that the Cultural Revolution is bound to last for 1,000 or even for 10,000 years, or that the Little Red Book has at last succeeded in making Marxism Chinese, or these pearls. The sound of men reciting quotations from Mao in strong clear tones is heard in every army unit. Drought holds no fears for us. The thought of Mao Zedong is our fertilizing rain. The head of state was adjudged responsible for not having foreseen the volte-face of Marshal Chiang Kai-shek when he unleashed his forces on the communist forces. The references to the 1927 coup, which everyone in China foresaw perfectly, but had to suffer passively in compliance with Stalin's orders. A Maoist choir singing a hymn entitled 100 Million People Take Up Arms to criticize the sinister book of self-perfection, a once official but insignificant booklet by Liu Shaoqi. The list could be extended ad infinitum, but let us close it with a bon mot from the People's Daily for July 31, 196-7. The present situation of the proletarian cultural revolution in China is excellent, but the class struggle is becoming more difficult. All the hot air notwithstanding, the historical lessons of this period are simple. Wherever China may be headed, the image of the last revolutionary bureaucratic regime is now shattered. Internal collapse has been added to repeated foreign policy disasters, including the annihilation of Indonesian Stalinism, the break with Japanese Stalinism, the destruction of Vietnam by the United States and, last but not least, Beijing's declaration this July that the Naxalbari insurrection heralded Maoist peasant revolution throughout India just days before the movement was put down by the very first intervention by the police. By clinging to their fantastical view, the Chinese communists have lost the greater part of their Indian support, that is to say, the last great bureaucratic party whose loyalty they still retained. Meanwhile, the underlying cause of China's internal crisis is its failure to industrialize the country and make itself into a model for underdeveloped nations. Stretched to its absolute limit, ideology disintegrates. Its supreme form is also its absolute zero, the night where all ideological cows are black. When bureaucrats battle one another in total confusion, all invoking the same dogma and seeing bourgeois hiding behind the red flag everywhere, doublethink has manifestly come unstuck. The joyous end of ideological lies, struck dead by ridicule, is at hand. It is not China, but our world at large that has generated the ridicule. We wrote in the August 1961 issue of International Situationiste that this world was destined to become more and more painfully ridiculous on every level until its complete revolutionary reconstruction. We now see that process playing out. The proletarian critique of the coming era will be conscious of having nothing of its own to protect or conserve, conscious that all its existing ideological props have been pulled away in an atmosphere of shame and fear, by thus discovering that it has been dispossessed of the false assets of a world of lies. That critique will recognize that it is the determinate negation of the whole of world society. It will realize as much, too, in China. At present it is the work-lead decomposition of the bureaucratic international that is making itself felt in that country. A central authority crumbles into independent provinces. In this way, China is rediscovering its past, which presents it with the real unfulfilled revolutionary tasks of a movement defeated years ago, the present moment, when, so we are told, Mao is recommencing in 1967 what he started in 1927, Le Monde, February 17th, is in fact the moment when the masses of workers and peasants have surged across the whole country for the first time since 1927. As difficult as it may be for consciousness to develop and for autonomous objectives to be realized, the fact is that something in the total domination suffered until now by the Chinese workers has disappeared. The proletarian mandate from heaven is now a dead letter. Postscriptum, October, 1967. The above text, first issued as a pamphlet on August 16, 1967, is reprinted here unmodified. The most recent news from China has merely confirmed the seriousness of the current turmoil. A Sick Planet written by Guy Debord in 1971. This text was intended for publication in Internationale Situationiste 13, which never appeared. It was first published in the French edition of the present collection in 2004. It may also be found in Guy Debord, over, Pollution is in fashion today, exactly in the same way as revolution. It dominates the whole life of society, and it is represented in illusory form in the spectacle. It is the subject of mind-numbing chatter in a plethora of erroneous and mystifying writing and speech, yet it really does have everyone by the throat. It is on display everywhere as ideology, yet it is continually gaining ground as a material development. Two antagonistic tendencies, progression towards the highest form of commodity production and the project of its total negation, equally rich in contradictions within themselves, grow ever stronger in parallel with one another. Here are the two sides whereby a sole historical moment, long awaited and often described in advance in partial and inadequate terms, is made manifest. The moment when it becomes impossible for capitalism to carry on working, a time that possesses all the technical means necessary for the complete transformation of the conditions of life on Earth, is also a time thanks to that same separate technical and scientific development, with the ability to ascertain and predict, with mathematical certainty just where, and by what date, the automatic growth of the alienated productive forces of class society is taking us, to measure, in other words, the rapid degradation of the very conditions of survival, in both the most general and the most trivial senses of that term. Backward-looking gas bags continue to waffle about, against, the aesthetic criticism of all this, fancying themselves clear-eyed and modem and in tune with their times when they argue that motorways, or the public housing of a place like Sarcelles, have their own beauty, a beauty preferable after all to the discomforts of picturesque old neighborhoods. These realists solemnly observe that the population as a whole, pace those nostalgic for real cooking, now eat far better than formerly. What they fail to grasp is that the problem of the degeneration of the totality of the natural and human environment has already ceased to present itself in terms of a loss of quality, be it aesthetic or of any other kind. The problem has now become the more fundamental one of whether a world that pursues such a course can preserve its material existence. In point of fact, the impossibility of its doing so is perfectly demonstrated by the entirety of detached scientific knowledge, which no longer debates anything in this connection except for the length of time still left and the palliative measures that might conceivably, if vigorously applied, stave off disaster for a moment or two. This science can do no more than walk hand in hand with the world that has produced it and that holds it fast down the path of destruction, yet it is obliged to do so with eyes open. It thus epitomizes almost to the point of caricature the uselessness of knowledge in its unapplied form. Admirably accurate measurements and projections are continually being made concerning the rapid increase in the chemical pollution of the breathable atmosphere, as of rivers, streams and, already, oceans. The irreversible accumulation of radioactive waste attending the development of nuclear power for so-called peaceful purposes, the effects of noise, the pervasion of space by plastic junk that threatens to tum it into an everlasting refuse dump, birth rates wildly out of control, the demented vitiation of foodstuffs, the urban sprawl everywhere overrunning what was once town and countryside, and, likewise, the spread of mental illness including the neurotic fears and hallucinations that are bound to proliferate in response to pollution itself, the alarming features of which are placarded everywhere and of suicide, whose rate of increase precisely parallels the accelerating construction of this environment, not to mention the effects of nuclear or bacteriological warfare, the wherewithal for which is already to hand, hanging over us like the sword of Damocles, even though it is, of course, avoidable. In short, if the scope and even the reality of the terrors of the year 1000 are still a subject of controversy among historians, terror of the year 2000 is as patent as it is well-founded. Indeed, it is now based on scientific certainty. At the same time, what is happening is by no means fundamentally new, rather, it is simply the ineluctable outcome of a long-standing process. A society that is ever more sick, but ever more powerful, has recreated the world, everywhere and in concrete form as the environment and backdrop of its sickness. It has created a sick planet, a society that has not yet achieved homogeneity, and that is not yet self-determined, but instead ever more determined by a part of itself positioned above itself, external to itself, has set in train a process of domination of nature that has not yet established domination over itself. Capitalism has at last demonstrated, by virtue of its own dynamics, that it can no longer develop the forces of production, and this, not in a quantitative sense, as many have taken it, but rather in a qualitative one. For bourgeois thought, however, speaking methodologically, only the quantitative is valid, measurable and efficient, whereas the qualitative is no more than vague subjective or artistic decoration of the really true, which is gauged solely by its actual avoirdupois. For dialectical thought, by contrast, and hence for history and for the proletariat, the qualitative is the most decisive dimension of real progress. That is what capitalism, on the one hand, and we, on the other, will eventually have demonstrated. The masters of society are now obliged to speak of pollution, both in order to combat it, for after all they live on the same planet as we do, which is the only sense in which it may be said that the development of capitalism has in effect brought about a measure of class fusion, and in order to conceal it, for the plain fact that such harmful and dangerous trends exist constitutes an immense motive for revolt, a material requirement of the exploited just as vital as the struggle of 19th century proletarians for the right to eat. Following the fundamental failure of the reformisms of the past, all of which without exception aspired to the definitive solution of the problem of class, a new kind of reformism is heaving into view, which answers to the same needs as the earlier varieties, namely the oiling of the machine and the opening up of new profitable areas to cutting-edge enterprises. The most modern sector of industry is racing to get involved with the various palliatives to pollution, seeing these as so many new opportunities made all the more attractive by the fact that a good part of the capital monopolized by the state is available for investment and manipulation in this sphere. While this new reformism is guaranteed to fail for exactly the same reasons as its predecessors, it differs radically from them in that it has run out of time. The growth of production has until now entirely confirmed its nature as the realization of political economy, as the growth of poverty, which has invaded and laid waste the very fabric of life, a society where the producers kill themselves working, and can do nothing but contemplate the product of their labor, now allows them in all transparency to see and breathe the general result of alienated labor, which has proven equally lethal. This society is ruled by an overdeveloped economy which turns everything, even spring water and city air, into economic goods, which is to say that everything has become economic ill. That complete denial of man which has now reached its perfect material conclusion, the conflict in capitalism between modern productive forces and the relations of production, whether bourgeois or bureaucratic, has entered its final stage. The rate of production of non-life has risen continually on its linear and cumulative course, a final threshold having just been passed in this progression. What is now produced, directly, is death. Throughout a world where employers wield all the power thanks to the institution of labor as a commodity, the ultimate, acknowledged and essential function of the developed economy of today is the production of employment. A far cry indeed from the progressive 19th century expectation that science and technology would reduce human labor by increasing productivity, and thus more easily satisfy the needs heretofore deemed real by all, without any fundamental change in the quality of the goods made available to that end. It is for the sake of creating jobs, even in country areas now devoid of peasants, that is to say for the sake of using human labor as alienated labor, as wage labor, that everything else is done, and hence that, stupidly, the very foundations of the life of the species at present, even more fragile than the thinking of a Kennedy or a Brezhnev, are put at risk. The old ocean itself cares not for pollution, but history is by no means indifferent to it. History can be saved only by the abolition of labor as a commodity, and historical consciousness has never been in such great and urgent need of mastering its world, for the enemy at its gates is no longer illusion but its own death. When the pitiful masters of a society whose wretched destiny is now discernible a fate far worse, be it said, than those evoked in the fulminations of even the most radical utopians of an earlier time, are obliged to admit that our environment has become a social issue, and that the management of everything has become directly political, right down to the herb of the fields and the possibility of drinking water, sleeping without pills or washing without developing sores. In such circumstances, it is obvious that the old specialized politics must perforce declare itself utterly bankrupt. Bankrupt, indeed, in the supreme expression of its voluntarism, namely the totalitarian bureaucratic power of the so-called socialist regimes, where the bureaucrats in power have proved incapable of managing even the previous stage of the capitalist economy. If these regimes pollute much less, the United States alone produces 50% of worldwide pollution, it is simply because they are much poorer. A country such as China, if it is to retain respect as a power among impoverished nations, has no choice but to sacrifice a disproportionate part of its slim budget to the generation of a decent quantity of pollution, as for example, to the rediscovery or touching up of the technology of thermonuclear war, or, more precisely, of the terrifying spectacle of thermonuclear war. Such a high quotient of poverty, both material and mental, buttressed by so much terror, amounts to a death warrant for the bureaucracies presently in power. What dooms the most modern forms of bourgeois power, by contrast, is a surfeit of wealth that is in effect poisoned. The supposedly democratic management of capitalism, in any country, offers nothing except the electoral victories and defeats that, as has always been obvious, have never changed anything in general and precious little in particular with respect to a class society which imagines that it can last forever. Nor do elections change anything more on those occasions when the system of management itself enters a crisis and affects to desire some vague kind of guidance in the resolution of secondary but urgent problems from an alienated end. stupefied electorate as in the United States, Italy, Great Britain or France. All the experts have long noted without bothering to explain the fact that voters almost never change their opinions, the reason being that voters are people who for a brief instant assume an abstract role that is designed, precisely, to prevent them from existing in their own right and, hence, from changing. This mechanism has been analyzed countless times by demystified political science and by revolutionary psychoanalysis alike. Nor are voters more likely to change because the world around them is changing ever more precipitately. Qua voters, they would not change even if the world was coming to an end. Every representative system is essentially conservative, whereas the conditions of a capitalist society have never been susceptible of conservation. They are continually, and ever more rapidly, undergoing modification, but decisions in this regard which always ultimately favor giving the market economy its head are left entirely to politicians, who are no more than publicists, whether they run uncontested or against others who are going to do just the same thing and say so loudly. And yet the person who has just voted freely for the Gaullists or for the French Communist Party, just like someone who has been forced to vote for a Gomulka, is quite capable of showing who they really are a week later by taking part in a wildcat strike or an insurrection. In its state-run and regulated form, the fight against pollution is bound, at first, to mean no more than new specializations, ministries, jobs for the boys and promotions within the bureaucracy. The fight's effectiveness will be perfectly consonant with that approach. It will never amount to a real will for change until the present system of production is transformed root and branch. It will never be vigorously carried on until all pertinent decisions, made democratically and in full knowledge of the issues by the producers, are permanently monitored and executed by those producers themselves. Oil tankers will inevitably spill their cargo into the ocean, for example, until they are brought under the authority of authentic sailors Soviets. Before the producers can rule and act on such questions, however, they must become adults. They must, all of them, seize power. 19th century scientific optimism foundered over three main issues. The first was the claim that the advent of revolution was certain, and that it would ensure the happy resolution of existing conflicts. This was the left Hegelian and Marxist illusion, the least acutely felt among the bourgeois intelligentsia, but the richest, and ultimately the least illusory. The second issue was a view of the universe, or even simply of matter, as harmonious. And the third was a euphorically linear conception of the development of the forces of production. Once we come to terms with the first issue, we shall deal by extension with the third, thus enabling us, albeit much later, to address the second, to make it into that which is at stake for us. It is not the symptoms but the illness itself that must be cured. Today, fear is everywhere and we shall escape it only through our own strength, our own ability to destroy every existing kind of alienation and every image of the power that has been wrested from us. Only by submitting everything except ourselves to the sole power of workers' councils, possessing and continually reconstructing the totality of the world by submitting everything, in other words, to an authentic rationality, a new legitimacy. As for the natural and the man-made environment, as for birth rates, biology, production, madness and so on, the choice will not be between festival and unhappiness but, rather, consciously and at every turn in the road, between a myriad of possibilities on the one hand, happy or disastrous but relatively reversible, and nothingness on the other. The terrible choices of the near future, by contrast, amount to but one alternative: total democracy or total bureaucracy. Those with misgivings about total democracy should try to test its possibility for themselves by giving it a chance to prove itself in action. Otherwise, they might as well pick themselves a tombstone, for, as Joseph Dejik put it, we have seen authority at work, and its work condemns it utterly. The slogan "Revolution or Death" is no longer the lyrical expression of consciousness in revolt. Rather, it is the last word of the scientific thought of our century. It applies to the perils facing the species as to the inability of individuals to belong. In a society where it is well known that the suicide rate is on the increase, the experts had to admit, reluctantly, that during May 1968, in France it fell to almost nil. That spring also vouchsafed us a clear sky, and it did so effortlessly, because few cars were burnt and the shortage of petrol prevented the others from polluting the air. When it rains, when there are clouds of smog over Paris, let us never forget that it is the government's fault. Alienated industrial production makes the rain. Revolution makes the sunshine.